Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest in public health research series today. I'm just going to wait another second to make sure everybody gets logged in. Great, we're happy to see you all. Today we are really thrilled to have Professor Sean Darling-Hammond with us to present his work on school practices and student mental health. Sean is a Cal alumni who got his PhD in public policy at the Goldman School and also a law degree at Berkeley. So go Bears. And thanks so much, Sean, for being here today. So I'll give the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. It is a pleasure to be presenting to this group that is near and dear to my heart. I love coming to the latest in public health series, and yeah, I'm honored to be presenting today. So I'm going to start by, I know it's like the time is tight, right? So I'm going to start by one, being very transparent about our technological limitations. Often people will put questions in the chat. I can't see them. So if you have a burning question, I guess put it in the chat. I'll try to make sure I get to them by the end. And if it's truly burning, maybe just unmute and ask. I'll be okay with that if it's just a clarifying data question. But yeah, just bear in mind that if it's a long question, you probably won't get back to the deck. So I'm going to start with an introduction. And by way of introduction, this is a comic that the members of my family say is a great representation of my brain at work. So you've got the brain saying, let's see what's on our agenda today. They have a to-do list that says overthink everything. They say they think they can do that, and then they wonder if they can. So that's a little bit similar to how my brain often operates. We'll talk about scholastic pathways of embodiment of mental health outcomes. We'll talk about peer racial harassment, then school-based mental health providers as a potential salve for some of the mental health conditions and trends that we're seeing, and then relationship-oriented practices as a further salve. A little bit more introduction. Some of you know this, but those who Google me for the first time will probably find this photo on the left. So I always out myself in presentations and let folks know that I did indeed compete on American Ninja Warrior for a number of years, but that is 2 kids ago. And so there's the then and here's the now. I turned 41 on Monday, and I am ecstatic to be in this stage of my life where you have Cyrus, my 2-year-old, Kofi, my 6-year-old, and Valentina, my wife, just enjoying the slow life. No more ninja, more family. As Lauren mentioned, I have a JD and a PhD, but I also have some applied experience working in K-12 schools. So just a little bit about my research and what I do. I do use legal and critical methods to study public policy and public health trends. Most of my scholarship in that regard was before I got my PhD, but I recently published something in Health Affairs Forefront, largely thanks to Osagi. So thank you, Osagi, for nudging me to get back into doing that kind of work. I do qualitative and mixed methods research. So I presented at IHD last semester on some of my qualitative and mixed methods research, looking at how we can implement relationship-oriented practices in ways that realize theorized benefits. I do psychological and mindset intervention work. I'll actually be presenting an IPSR tomorrow on that. And those primarily are collaborations with Jason Okonofuo, who we sadly lost to Brown, but I'm still keeping him in our orbit by doing work with him, and Jennifer Eberhardt at Stanford, who's just the best. And I also do research partnerships with county offices of ed. Those are burgeoning, but I have one with Santa Clara and one with Fairfax in Virginia, and those are both going to be practices or projects that are about really making relationship-oriented practices work in spite of the political headwinds and the sort of behavioral headwinds that we often face when we try to shift practices of professionals in the service of kids. But today, I'll be talking about my quantitative research using the California Schools Data System, or Cal Schools, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a bit. I wanted to shout out my lab. The work that I'm presenting today would not exist in large measure without the members of my lab. To the right is the lab as it existed at the end of last year, but on the bottom, you will see that the lab has grown. I'm hoping that some of my lab folks are here watching the presentation, but they are truly the heart of my experience here at Berkeley. I am so grateful for their work. THESIS is the name of the lab, and it stands for Thriving in Health Equity Through Social Inclusion in Schools. It is an acronym, not a backronym. I actually did try to find something that would make sense instead of just kind of be forced. So hopefully it works. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about Cal Schools. So why do I have Ocean's 11 here? Well, when I was starting my PhD, I really felt like one of the characters in Ocean's 11 because I found out about this incredible data system called Cal Schools that was under lock and key and owned by WestEd, a major research private sector organization in California. And I thought, how can I unlock the vault of this data and start to do research on school practices over time, student mental health outcomes, and then try to combine these data with other data sources. And it turned out the easiest way to do it was to get a job there. So during my PhD, I spent 3 years as a researcher at Wested, got access to the data and started to really understand it. I later found out that you can just buy the data. So if folks are interested in the data that I'm going to be presenting today, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm always excited to collaborate. As Sabrina Boyce knows, I'm ecstatic to collaborate with anybody who is curious about what the Cal Schools data. She is also very expert on those. And yeah, hopefully I'll whet your appetite today and you'll be coming to me with interesting Wested Cal Schools data questions. The data is comprised of 3 data systems. One is the California Healthy Kid Survey, CHKS, which is their survey of elementary, middle, and high school students. The data that I have is millions of students over 10 years. Another is the California Survey of School Staff, which is hundreds and thousands of school staff over these last 10 years. And the last is the California Parent Survey. So in a set of schools, they also surveyed a pretty large number of parents, and they asked them all a lot of the same questions. So you get to see if you have a different experience depending on the informant. The coverage is crazy. It's about 5,000 schools, and it's about 3/4 of all middle and high schools in the state. There are very few states that have a data system like that. It's like North Carolina, Oregon, us. So it's great to take advantage of it. And then about 1/3 of the CHK schools also participate in these really rich submodules. The stuff that I'll be presenting today is primarily based on the core module, which is what's asked of all the students. But the submodules cover all sorts of really interesting stuff about school climate, social and emotional learning. Some of them look at school policing, which I'll be talking about tomorrow at the EBSR talk. So yeah, please let me know if your appetite is whetted and you're curious. So now let's talk about scholastic pathways of embodiment. So this is data from the Youth Risk and Behavior Survey, YRBS, from 2013 through 2023. And what we see is when we look at the extent to which students say that they experience persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness, you see a pretty large increase from 30% to 40% indicating feeling those kinds of persistent sad and lonely feelings. We also see small increase in percent indicating they attempted suicide, made a suicidal plan, or attempted suicide. So the suicidality outcomes are also seeing increases. But when you disaggregate the data, you actually see that the picture is a little bit more complex, in some respects more concerning. So I took the YRBS data and then I made what's on the right. So essentially we see that for students, generally we saw that sort of 10 percentage point increase, but it's differential by race. So Hispanic students had a 5 percentage point increase, multiracial 7 percentage point, Asian 3 percentage point, but Black and white students saw 13 and 12 percentage point increases respectively. So in particular, the old wisdom was that Black students did not have, and Black youth did not have escalated mental health outcomes. And we're not sort of a priority population when it came to mental health issues. This is the earned wisdom from the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s, when a lot of the really big structural determinants scholars were starting to shift the field. That is not the case now. Increasingly, we're seeing that there is a reason to ring the alarm bell for the mental health conditions of Black youth. And I'll talk a little bit about why that might be the case. We see similar trends when we look at suicidality. So this is those who have, I'm sorry, I'm having to move my Zoom controls. There we go, attempted suicide. Similar, you get a similar picture if you look at suicidal ideation or planning. But this is suicidal attempts. And so when we look at the percentage of students disaggregated, we see that for white and Black students, you have these 6 percentage point increases. Much smaller increases are actually indeed decreases for multiracial Hispanic and Asian students. Okay, hopefully it's going to go for it. There we go. So why might this be the case? Why might we be seeing generally increases in the degree to which students are feeling sad and lonely, and also increases that are differential by race? So this is a little bit of a framework that I've been developing over the last few years for scholastic pathways of embodiment. The idea here is that mental health challenges are largely a function of the way that kids' brains develop and the way that their stress systems develop, which are in turn largely a function of the social milieu that they inhabit. Students who are more likely to be exposed to scholastic exclusion and punishment are perhaps more likely to develop, sorry, there should have been green arrow there as well, develop cortisol reactivity that can high wire their stress systems and drive mental health challenges. They also are more likely to have negative scholastic relationships. Those negative scholastic relationships themselves can be a problem. So with social media shifting the way that students relate to each other, we're seeing a lot more online bullying and harassment. And the sort of temperature in our rhetoric has shifted that in ways that have also increased the extent to which students are being exposed to racial harassment. We'll talk about that a bit later. And finally, there's harmful coping behavior, which is largely substance abuse, but there are other types as well. That can really be a big driver of abnormal brain development, which can lead to mental health challenges down the line. Eventually, I'd love to do the kinds of like longitudinal mediated modeling that would allow me to vet whether this conceptual model exists. But for now, it's kind of a helpful framework when I'm thinking about the research questions that can be asked and interrogated using these California Healthy Kid Survey data. So I mentioned before that there's sort of a shift in our social milieu. So this is work that Kurt Klaus and Elena Lee, two of my thesis students, have helped put together on a project we call SPOT, or School Practices Over Time. And so one of the things we looked at was whether students are growing less connected to their scholastic environment over time. So there was kind of like really great heyday in 2015, 16, 17 in that bi-year where students were feeling more connected. Ever since, the degree of school connection has declined. School connection is a validated scale measure that is comprised of 5 questions. I won't go into the questions now because we have too many measures to play with, but I can come back to it later if folks want. But these data come from 3 million middle and high school students in California. The data is being grouped by bi-years because that's the sampling frame that California Healthy Kids Survey primarily uses. The vast majority of schools participate every other year, but they stagger which year they participate. So by doing bi-yearly amalgamation of data, you end up capturing sort of a scholastic experience of a bi-year that is representative of the state. But the results are actually really similar if we, instead of looking at all the students in a bi-year, if we look at a representative panel of schools of any size, or a representative panel of schools that have a higher precision threshold, so that have 100 or more student surveys in each of the bi-years that we're looking at. So you can see the shape doesn't really change. Big picture, we had this period in 2015, 16, 17, 17 where school connectedness was a little better, and it's declining pretty regularly since then. But let's stop for a second before we get super data wonky and humanize all this for a little bit. So we live in a moment in history where kids are connecting to each other less and less richly than ever before because they have digital devices that absorb almost all of their attention. They are engaging with one another in a context where many of them are still exhibiting the sort of vestiges of the pandemic in their social and emotional aptitude and ability to connect. They are connecting at a moment when political rhetoric is at a crazy high, and partisan divides have created challenges having families connect in many circumstances, where they are constantly worried that one of their peers might bring a firearm into their school. And this is particularly true for middle and high school students. So recent research from 3 years ago found that the majority of students fear that an active shooting might occur at their school on any given day. So even if the likelihood of it actually happening is low, the likelihood of them worrying about it happening is quite high. And you can imagine what that might do to one's stress processing. So that's kind of what's going on for kids. And so we should be interrogating whether the scholastic practices are buttressing them or protecting them against this kind of psychological assault that they're having as a function of the social milieu that they inhabit that we could never have imagined, right? I was talking with my wife recently about what it meant for us to connect with peers, and it was landlines, We actually just yesterday had my 6-year-old call his friend, who's also 6, on essentially like a landline style connection and have a chat. And it was so adorable and so wholesome. And they'll probably never get to do that again once they turn 8 because everyone around them is going to have a smartphone and they're going to be connecting in this other much more socially pernicious way, consuming media that is way, way beyond what they should be consuming in an environment where there's nobody to help them navigate it. So I wanted to just humanize it a little bit because I think when we start to go deep on these mental health outcomes, we forget what it's like to be a kid right now and what that means in terms of what our sort of obligation is as public health scholars and professionals to serve their needs. So having humanized, in that little graphic before, one of the risk regulators that I pointed out was exposure to exclusionary punishment, which is being suspended or expelled from school. And burgeoning research indicates that when students are suspended, it actually has a measurable impact on the likelihood that they will develop mental health challenges in the short term. And Angton and Nino's work has found that that actually persists all the way through mid-adulthood. So kids who are suspended when they're in K-12 are more likely to be depressed as mid-adults. Some work that I'm looking at also looks at whether there are cognitive impacts on that as well. But for now, we have strong reason to suspect that being suspended is a real risk regulator. But there's differential exposure to this risk regulator. So this is research that I published last year that finds that no matter how you slice federal data, Black students are markedly more likely to experience every single form of scholastic exclusion and punishment, and that is true across subpopulations. So this is just a typical Black-white risk ratio. A value of 1 would indicate that the percentage of Black students experiencing an outcome is equivalent to the percentage of white students experiencing that outcome. So for example, we see that among all students, which is the blue bars, Black students are 2.5 times more likely to have experienced an in-school suspension, 3.6 times more likely to experience an out-of-school suspension, et cetera. But we see that these Black-white risk ratios are north of 1 almost across the board for each of the subpopulations. All students, boys, girls, SPED students, special education students, students in wealthier and less wealthy schools, in traditional schools, magnet, charter, alternative, even preschool. And it's true for all of the outcomes too. And that includes corporal punishment, which is, spankings, things that we don't have in California, but are legal in 22 states. I point this out just to say that as we're thinking about the risk regulators, the things that drive students to feel less connected, to feel more of a sense of loneliness, to feel more mental health strain, schools are a big driver of this, and there's a differential experience depending on the student. Okay, there we go. Another risk regulator is the extent to which students feel like their school is a place that is a connected space. Voigt and colleagues in 2013 found that Black students are much less likely to report experiencing a high degree of school connectedness relative to their peers. You can see that from their little table 1. It's kind of dated, so I reran a similar kind of analysis using the data that I just mentioned, school practices over time data. And indeed, we find that there are enduring racial gaps in the degree to which students feel close to the people at school. So Black students are here in orange. All students are here in blue. It would have been the same if I'd done white students or Asian students or Hispanic students. It's actually pretty similar. There's this gap where Black students are just feeling less connected to their scholastic environment. For those who are like, what about the confidence interval? Bear in mind, this is data from like 3.4 million students. So the standard errors are all microscopic, and the confidence intervals are therefore also microscopic. So these are all statistically significant differences, but that's largely a function of the power that we have to detect the difference. Okay, we've talked about scholastic pathways of embodiment. Now let's talk about peer racial harassment in schools. And I want to sort of zoom out a little bit. I mentioned that I have a legal background. One of the things that happens when you are connected to what's happening in courts, but also in a school of social science, is you see the disconnect. And so one of the places where I see a pretty marked disconnect is that legal scholars in the K-12 space are really focused on peer racial harassment in schools as something that schools have an obligation to proactively respond to. And there are a few pretty large cases where schools ended up having to pay out huge sums of money because they were aware of peer racial harassment, but didn't do enough to correct it. In one case, the victim of the peer racial harassment ended up winning $1 million monetary judgment from the school district. Now, mind you, this is not them winning a judgment from the student who was harassing them. This is them winning a judgment from the school, suggesting that legal scholars increasingly perceive schools as having a proactive obligation to try to protect students from this pernicious experience. Public health scholarship has been a lot slower to focus on peer racial harassment in schools, and has instead looked at sort of exposure to racism across contexts and across actors. But I think that there is something uniquely pernicious about peer racial harassment in schools. Schools are places students have no choice but to go, and their peers are often people who they rely on to have some kind of semblance of community. So I think we should be thinking a little bit more about peer racial harassment in schools and who is exposed to it. So I'm going to be still focusing in this bit of analysis on 1 year of California Healthy Schools data, or California Healthy Kids Survey data, which is one of the Cal Schools data systems. we'll be looking at just about 350,000 middle and high school students. Among these students, 15% indicated that they had been exposed to racial harassment in their school. 33% also indicated experiencing depressive symptoms. And then 85% actually had a school mental health provider, an SMHP, in their school. We'll talk about why that might be important later. So a large number of them had something that could be protective against racial harassment and depression. So when we look among the students who had a school mental health provider, and we look at the demographics of the school mental health providers, we see that the majority of the students who had a school mental health provider had a white school mental health provider in their school. A majority also had a Hispanic mental health provider, indicating that obviously many students who have one have more than one, right? Because they can be a school counselor or a school psychologist or some other school mental health provider. But much smaller percentages had a school mental health provider that was of another race, Asian or Black or American Indian Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander. And this matters to the extent that you believe that part of what allows a relationship-oriented intervention to work is the degree to which the adult can connect to the kid. And there is a body of research on what's called race matching in schools that finds that students end up having better relationships with teachers who match their race, end up being less likely to be subjected to suspensions when their teacher matches their race, end up having higher GPAs when the teacher matches their race. So there's this kind of like growing body of race matching scholarship. So this analysis is going to be playing with ideas of peer racial harassment in schools, school mental health providers, and depressive symptoms. So diving in, here we go. In a confounder adjusted model, subdivided by population, we first find that students who experience racial harassment are much more likely to have to exhibit depressive symptoms. So here, this is a pure confounder adjusted model predicting whether or not the dichotomous student exhibits depressive symptoms as a function of whether or not they've experienced racial harassment, their sex, male or female, whether they are LGBTQ+, where the sort of reference category is straight, and then their parents' level of high school or of education, where the reference category is parent did not graduate high school, with fixed effects for grade and school. And what we find is across each subpopulation, students who have experienced racial harassment are about 22 percentage points more likely to have depressive symptoms. So this idea that pure racial harassment is perhaps uniquely pernicious is somewhat supported in these data. Also worth noting that these analyses sort of support prior analyses that found that female students, LGBTQ+ students, and students who have parents who have less education are more likely to exhibit depressive symptoms. But there is an unequal burden of exposure to racial harassment. So if racial harassment is pernicious, we might ask who's experiencing it. And the answer is Black students are much more likely. So whereas 15% of students generally experience peer racial harassment in schools, 28% of Black students experience it, 21% and 20% of Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, and Asian students, 19% of American Indian Alaska Native, and then much smaller percentages of Hispanic and white students, 11 and 9% respectively. It's notable here that Asian students are experiencing what I would consider to be an atypically high degree of exposure to this risk. And I say that because there is, and for those who sort of came to the talks for our recent hire in the health and social behavior, you'll know that there is this movement towards being more thoughtful about the degree to which Asian students are experiencing a sort of model minority protected experience or actually are quite at risk of exposure to various kinds of racism. And here we see that sort of relative to other risks that Asian students experience, they're experiencing a really high degree of exposure to this particular risk. So that's something to keep track of, I think, as we explore. And one of the projects that thesis is looking at is looking at the degree to which Asian students of different ethnicities are being exposed to peer racial harassment. So hopefully, maybe at next year's round of talks, I'll have results on that. But anyway, kind of turning back to this, Black students are much more likely to experience peer racial harassment in schools. And if you look at the set of students who have experienced 4 or more incidents in the last year of racism from their peers, 14% of Black students have experienced 4 or more incidents. And just imagine what that feels like to have somebody maybe call you a racial slur or to exclude you specifically because of your racial identity, and have that happen not just once, not just twice, not just 3 times, but 4 or more times over the course of the school year. And what that might do to your sense of connection, to your sense of pride in yourself and in your cultural heritage, to your sense of desire to be at the school, what that might do across a variety of different domains that might then in turn be related to your mental health outcomes. So sort of turning back to the school practices over time work, we also find that exposure to racial harassment in schools is not only differential, but it's actually widening, right? So in 2013-14 school year, the gap between all students and Black students and the proportion who had experienced peer racial harassment in schools was narrower than the gap that we now see in the most recent year of data in 22-23. So this is a concerning and growing more concerning phenomenon. All right, so we talked about peer racial harassment in schools, and I sort of teased the idea that school-based mental health providers might be a salve, and that we might be thinking about the racial match between between the student and the school mental health provider. So let's talk about that a little bit. But before we dive into the numbers, I want to make sure that we have a clear sense of what it means to have a school that has a school mental health provider. Many people think of school mental health providers as the school psychologist who sits in an office that's detached from the main campus structurally and has one-on-one interactions with students throughout the day. Or in a more severe situation, and this does happen in many districts, the school psychologist spends their entire day simply looking over reams of paperwork and determining which students will get access to which resources. That is not always how school mental health providers are engaged in their scholastic work. And indeed, if you look at how the National Association of School Psychologists and the National Association of School Counselors, NASP and NASC, describe the ideal integration of school mental health providers, they describe a professional who is really driving the culture of the entire school through assemblies with all students about how to be respectful across difference, how to manage one's own impulses and thoughts, how to communicate about sort of curiosities about social divides in healthy ways, how to be respectful and kind, but also providing professional development to staff so that they can do that kind of protective and nurturing guidance for students when things happen, when there is a mistake and a student engages in racial harassment or bullying, so that there can be a growth opportunity rather than sort of deepening of that behavior and a distancing for the student who's been the victim of the behavior. But also, in many schools, and I consult for some of these school districts, school mental health providers are part of the leadership teams. There are PBIS, or positive behavioral and intervention support teams, and SEL, or social and emotional learning teams, that are comprised by professionals throughout the school. Typically, it'll be like a few teachers, some school mental health providers, the assistant principal, the principal, maybe a few parents. But in those contexts, these school mental health providers often have the ability to set school policy writ large, right? So they have the ability to decide what kinds of professional development all of the staff will get, to decide how the school should respond when there is an incidence of harassment or bullying. So you can imagine, given the various ways that they can sort of shift the culture of the school, the broad structural impact that they can have, and how that might be differential based on their lived experience and the degree to which an incident of racial harassment so you can imagine, like imagine an Asian student is the victim of racial harassment and the school mental health provider is also Asian. They might be able to understand the lived experience and the impact of that experience and communicate that to their peer staff and communicate that to the students in an assembly, and do that in a way that might shift behavior and shift mental health outcomes. So what do we find? We find that students who have exposure to a mental health provider generally are less likely to be exposed to racial harassment and less likely to exhibit depressive symptoms, but that the negative correlation between having a mental health provider in your school and being subjected to racial harassment is differential, conditioned on the race match. So for, sorry, I'm having to move my Zoom controls. There we go. For Asian students, the bar that is red here, the one that has the red box around it, is the correlation between having a school mental health provider and being exposed to racial harassment when that person has an Asian mental health provider. So the colors of the bars are being determined by the race of the mental health provider in their school. For Black students, we get the strongest negative correlation when they have a Black mental health provider. For Hispanic students, we get the strongest negative correlation when they have a Hispanic mental health provider. And for white students, we get the strongest negative correlation when they have a white mental health provider. And the generic chi-square test on each of these is statistically significant at the p less than 0.001 level, really high chi-squared values, which, you look at the chart, you would expect that. You see the sample size, you'd expect that. But it is interesting to see how there is some differential protective benefit when we have the addition of a mental health provider and a race match. Now, I would caution reading these results as indicating that schools should only employ mental health providers who match the demographic characteristics of the student population most at risk of experiencing racial harassment in that particular context. Because we do see that, for example, for Black students, having a mental health provider who is Asian or Hispanic also seems to be quite protective, right? And for NHPI students, it wasn't the case that we had the race match be the big driver. Having a mental health provider generally was more beneficial. So I think the big takeaways are, one, having a mental health provider is a big deal. And two, diversity in the profession matters quite a lot. And if you think about the sort of model I was setting out initially, that mental health providers can shift professional development, they can change the kinds of conversations that teachers are having, the ways that they're engaging with students, they can drive assemblies. It's maybe less about the particular race match and more about the extent to which the staff, including the mental health provider, can really see and appreciate the lived experience of a student who has experienced racial harassment and force engagement and change as a result of that moment. I'll just note that the results are actually quite similar when we switch our outcome from exposure to racial harassment to exhibiting depressive symptoms. All right, so here we go. I mentioned before that access to a school mental health provider who matches the racial demographics of students may be differential, in part because of the sort of set of school mental health providers we have and their demographics. So the proportion of white students who have a school mental health provider like them, 72%, Hispanic, 57%, Asian, 28%, Black, 20%, but NHPI and AIIN, 3% each, right? So again, I think perhaps the policy response isn't, we need to make sure that we have, a rainbow team of school mental health providers in each school, although that'd be phenomenal, but financially completely unrealistic. Perhaps the response is, we need to make sure we augment the cultural competence of the core of school mental health providers in schools so that any student can be really seen and responded to when they are experiencing peer racial harassment. All right, so we're going to close out by talking about relationship-oriented practices in schools. So I led off earlier with this sort of graphic that suggested that there were these risk regulators of mental health outcomes, scholastic risk regulators. I want to suggest that upstream of those scholastic risk regulators are specific school practices, in particular, social and emotional learning and conflict resolution. And what are these practices? So conflict resolution in schools involves staff being trained to guide students who are engaged in a conflict in resolving that conflict. So if you've heard of restorative practices or restorative justice, those are examples of conflict resolution practices. But the key insight here is that humans as social beings often feel very anxious and stressed when there is unresolved conflict, and can feel incredibly joyful and connected when conflicts are resolved and connections are restored. So conflict resolution being a really important structural intervention. And there's scholarship out there over the last few years that has suggested that restorative practices and other conflict resolution tools can be a really powerful structural intervention to enhance mental health outcomes for students. The other is social emotional learning. And the idea here is, if students are learning the skills necessary to be aware of their own cognitive and their own mental state, to communicate their emotional needs, to navigate complex conversations and feelings and dynamics, to solicit help when they need it, when they feel emotionally overwhelmed. If they have those skills, that can buffer them against negative occurrences, but also help them avoid those occurrences in the first place. It is much more painful if you have been exposed to a mistake by a peer to double down and respond even more aggressively and get in a fight than it is to have that experience, seek help from an adult, and go through a sort of a conflict resolution experience. it's very hard to expect students to go the less painful route if they don't have the skills to do that, right? So social emotional learning is, again, sort of positioned as a structural intervention. And I would say the vast majority of large school districts that I've connected to have some social emotional learning programming. The question is, when students get exposed to conflict resolution practices and social and emotional learning practices, do they benefit? Does it reduce their likelihood of exhibiting depressive symptoms or suicidal outcomes and suicidality? Again, though, let's humanize this for a bit. It's easy to take for granted how strange schools feel right now for kids, and the extent to which there's variation in that experience. So I want to just paint the picture for a second of two kinds of schools. And I've been in these kinds of schools, so this is not fiction. In one kind of school, staff really see their job as a job. They're ground down. Teachers are turning over constantly. There aren't really spaces where students connect with each other. There aren't traditions for students to feel pride in their school or connection to one another. There aren't traditions where staff really celebrate students. It's just not part of how things are done. It's all about putting out fires and helping kids learn as much as possible so you don't lose funding or have the school closed. That's one kind of school. And it is a lot more common than you would think. You can walk down the road outside of Berkeley and find schools like that within 5 miles. There's another kind of school, schools where staff are really excited to be there. They love their babies. They love the kids that they're training. They've created these rich structural opportunities that are built into the cadence of the year for students to connect with one another. Sort of spirit days or morning assemblies. There's music at drop-offs. The principal knows everybody. The teachers trust each other. They're connected to the students and to each other. They're connected to the families. You can also find those schools within a walk of Berkeley. Berkeley Arts Magnet is phenomenal on those dimensions. Imagine how different it is for a kid to be in either of those environments in terms of the degree to which they feel connected to their joy and their purpose, connected to their community, excited to wake up every day to go to this place that they're forced to go to every single day. Imagine how different it is. And so how can we sort of create more of the latter experience and avoid more of the former experience? And I think a big part of that is the degree to which schools have systematized social and emotional learning and conflict resolution so that relationships are kind of the glue that holds everything together. So let's see if that's what we find. So I'm going to add one layer here that we haven't been talking about thus far, and that's intersectionality of race and gender. So the pathways of embodiment that I mentioned before of exposure to exclusionary discipline, of exposure to negative scholastic conditions where there's sort of social disconnection, all of that is absolutely differential by race, but it's also potentially differential by race and gender. And if we look at the outcome side, we can see why we might suspect that that's the case. So American Indian girls have really high suicide rates, much higher than American Indian boys and much higher than other intersectionally identified race gender groups. When I mentioned before that there's sort of a growth in mental health challenges for Black students, that's largely being driven by Black girls. So the suicide rate for Black girls has more than doubled in the last decade. And then when we think about the sort of embodiment pathways that I described before, if we think that suspensions is a big driver of a lot of this, Black boys are way more likely to be exposed to scholastic suspensions than almost any other population, and certainly more than any other intersectionally race gender defined population. So few studies have sort of looked at the differential returns of relational practice like SEL, social emotional learning, and conflict resolution by either race or by gender. And at least as far as we're aware, my team and I on this project, we're the first to look at it by both. So what did we find? And I kind of already covered this. So let's go into the data. So I'm going to be using California Healthy Kids Survey data from 2013-14 through 2020-21. I don't think it'll be different if I add the last 2 years of data. I just merged those 2 years of data after I put this together and started the analysis. So why am I collapsing data across multiple years though? I want to be adequately powered to look at these intersectional groups. So when I'm looking at American Indian, Alaska Native students, I've got about 10K. When I'm looking at Native Hawaiian Pacific Island students, I've got about 13K. And that allows me to be adequately powered to explore the relationship between exposure to these relationship-oriented practices and mental health outcomes within these subpopulations, which are also going to be now stratified by gender. And so what do we find? And I won't say all of this, I'm just going to say briefly. We're going to be looking at both depressive symptoms and suicidal ideation over the last 12 months. Both of those are dichotomous. We're going to be looking at exposure to both conflict resolution and social emotional learning. The former is a single item measure. The latter is a validated scale. And then we're going to be controlling for a suite of controls, including students' academic performance, parental education, sexual orientation, transgender status, grade level, year of the survey that they took. So did they take it in 2013-14 or 2014-15, et cetera, and also their school of attendance. So in this confounder adjusted model, my BIXI is doing a lot of work, and that's intentional. We really want to try to isolate that unique connection by adjusting for everything that we can. All right, so what do we find? One, we find that adverse mental health rates are about 2 times lower for students who have the highest levels of exposure to conflict resolution and social emotional learning than they are for students who have the lowest levels of exposure. And that's true both for depressive symptoms and for suicidal ideation. So for example, when we're looking at depressive symptom percentages among those who have the lowest level of exposure to SEL, it's about half of students who have like really low levels of exposure to social emotional learning. Half of them are indicating that they have depressive symptoms. When we go along the axis, along the continuum of sort of exposure to social emotional learning, those who have the most exposure are at about 20% likelihood of exhibiting depressive symptoms. And we see similar sort of trends for each of these outcome by exposure combinations. So that's great. Seems to make a difference generally, but what about disaggregated results? So I'm going to show you this chart and spend a lot of time on it, but the results are pretty similar, remarkably similar across each of our outcome exposure combinations when we disaggregate it by race, by gender combinations. So as I mentioned, we see sort of a general trend. That's the gray top bar. In students who have more exposure to social emotional learning have lower depressive symptom rates for each unit increase in their exposure to social emotional learning. That is, however, differential by gender. The negative relationship is more pronounced for female students than for male students. And that continues to be the case as we cross that by race. So Black boys have a less pronounced negative relationship than Black girls. Hispanic boys have a less pronounced negative relationship than Hispanic girls, et cetera, et cetera. So generally speaking, what we find is the protective potential of social emotional learning seems to be stronger for girls than for boys across racial groups. In addition, we find that the protective potential is much lower for Black students than it is for students of other backgrounds. I'm going to now show you the other outcome by exposure combination so you can see how consistent this trend is. So here is depressive symptoms and conflict resolution. Again, we see this kind of, not jigsaw, but kind of like lower for the boys, higher for the girls, negative relationship between conflict resolution and depressive symptoms. And we see again that Black students are experiencing much lower protective potential than students of other backgrounds. And when we look at the next one, suicidal ideation by social and emotional learning, same trend. Girls more than boys, Black students less than other racial groups. And again, when we look at suicidal ideation and conflict resolution, same trend, right? So what do we take from this? One, more exposure to conflict resolution and social emotional learning seems to be protective. That's phenomenal, right? So we should be thinking about ways to augment exposure to these relational practices. Two, the link between these practices is weaker for Black students and much stronger for Asian and white students. So I think it'd be helpful to explore why we have this sort of reduction in effectiveness for Black students. Is that a function of the modes of delivery? Is it that when Black students are being exposed to SEL and conflict resolution, they're not being exposed to as effective of a version of it? Is it about cultural context? Do they not feel as much of a fit? Shui-Chin Lin, one of my thesis members as a postdoc, has been exploring the extent to which the cultural congruence between parents and teachers on social emotional learning matters, but maybe we should also be thinking about cultural congruence between the practitioner, the educator, and the kid. Does that matter? Does that sort of shift the extent to which it's protective? And then what can we do to augment the effectiveness? We could also be thinking about how the link is much stronger for female students than for male students. And I wonder if that's a function of the degree to which toxic masculinity plays a role in how boys in school absorb relational practices from their teachers? Do they feel less connected to their teacher when they're forced to be soft and mushy? Is there something we can do to try to change their mindsets around what it means to be relational so that they can get more of the benefit of this? But in addition, the fact that these interventions are so effective for girls is promising, given that girls exhibit some of the most pronounced mental health challenges, and in particular, girls of specific subpopulations. So American Indian, Alaska Native, and Black girls, and Asian girls actually too, exhibit some of the largest increases and largest rates of both suicidal ideation and depressive symptoms. So this is promising. And next, the link between social emotional learning and suicidal ideation was pronounced for American and Alaska Native girls, as I mentioned before. It might be a really powerful structural intervention in schools that serve large proportions of girls of that background. And finally, it was really striking to see how weak the relationship between these practices and mental health outcomes was for Black girls in particular. I mentioned before that the suicidal ideation outcomes had more than doubled over the last 10 years for Black girls. What does that mean in terms of what we need to do structurally to try to protect against that outcome if one of our core tools, sort of being more relational, isn't working? You know, is there something we need to do to augment the cultural fit? Is there something we need to do to put this research in conversation with the work that I just presented before on the race matching of the professional and the student? Is there something about sort of matching race and gender, making sure that there are folks who have cultural competence for the Black rural experience that might help us enhance the effectiveness of these relationship-oriented practices? So I know that was a lot. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm more than happy to answer questions. And yeah, truly honored to be able to present to this amazing group.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was fantastic. And I really learned a lot about all the challenges out there, and also amazing amount of data that you have access to, which is really, really rich. So thank you for presenting and sharing your work. Any questions? I know we're almost at time, but if there's any questions, people can put in the chat or raise your hand. Also, I'm sure you can reach out to Sean directly. I just put his email in the chat. Yeah, Fred, do you have a question?
Yeah, hi there. Great presentation, super fascinating. One of the things I was curious about is how much have you looked into peer support as another factor and peer support groups, things like that, as another factor?
Yeah, so that's not my lane, but I can tell you there is a scholar at Boston University who I just met at a Spencer convening. I'm blanking on his name, but I'll send it to you after, who looks at affiliation groups for LGBTQ plus students as like a really important protective factor, both to reduce the exposure to not racial harassment, but sort of identity-oriented harassment and bullying, and also to buffer against its impacts. I don't know that I would suspect that those groups would be as structurally powerful in a context where the students are not empowered to make structural change. So this is something that we were talking about at Spencer. So you can imagine like if you have like a Black student group, but they have no say over what kinds of professional development occurs or what teachers focus on, then it's really just kind of a club for a very lucky set of students to have some kinship. And it'll be very effective for those students potentially, but I don't expect a structural sort of widespread effect. So I think the sort of moderator is, are these kids empowered to change the conditions in the school? And in SFUSD, for example, there is incredible empowerment of youth that would allow those kinds of interventions to, I think, make a bigger difference.
Thanks, Sean.
All right, well, we're just about at time. Thank you so much again for sharing your work with us. We really appreciate it, and hope everyone has a good rest of the day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.